is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there today. We're talking about quarterbacks here for Week 9 fantasy football. Who should we start and who should we sit in every matchup? We're going to get into them here in just 1 second. We do have a few bye weeks though, so make sure this week if you are a Carson Wentz owner, Jared Goff, Baker Mayfield, Joe Burrow, you're not going to have them at your disposal. This week you're going to have to find a replacement. Plus, big name quarterback just popped up on the news here recently. Make sure you stay tuned. You don't want to miss out on that. However, before we get into Week 9, let's see how we did in Week 8. And overall, for quarterbacks in Week 8, it was a very disappointing week. I mean, a very low-scoring week all across the board for the majority of quarterbacks there in Week 8. But out of the 27 guys we gave start or sit designations to that completed their games this past weekend, got 15 of them correct for an accuracy percentage of 56%, which definitely needs to improve. We're hoping there's no more Week 8s in the mix because it was absolutely disgusting overall. Matthew Stafford, he was a miss. He went out and had a great performance against a very difficult matchup. Phillip Rivers, yep, he decided he wanted to throw some touchdowns. He was a miss. Carson Wentz, thought he would be a great start going up against Dallas. Yeah, not so much. Some of the hits. Ryan Tannehill continues to be a very consistent option there for your fantasy lineups. Joe Burrow, he's throwing the ball bunches all over the field. And Justin Herbert just continues to be arguably the best rookie quarterback in all of football this year. And yes, I do like Joe Burrow. Justin Herbert has just been that good. But now with Week 8 out of the way, hopefully we never have to deal with Week 8 in 2020 again because it was disgusting. Let's turn our attention here to Week 9 and kick it off with Thursday Night Football. And that's where we're going to find the Green Bay Packers and San Francisco 49ers, but we already have something that we need to pay pretty close attention to here leading up to Thursday Night Football. Kendrick Bourne of the San Francisco 49ers did test positive. They had to shut the facilities down. As of right now, Green Bay is on their way to San Francisco, and all signs are pointing to the game being played. However, any more positive tests pop up, it would not surprise me if this game gets moved maybe to a doubleheader on Monday. It's just something we need to pay attention to and really monitor here the remainder of the day. Now, does it really matter if this game plays on Thursday or Monday? Not really with these quarterbacks, right? I mean, with Aaron Rodgers, you're going to start him. We do not know the status of Aaron Jones as of yet. It does sound like he may not be available, and if he's not, that just means that Aaron Rodgers is going to continue to throw the ball a lot. He's currently averaging right around 22 fantasy points per game. He's thrown for at least 2 touchdowns, 6 out of the 7 games he's played so far this year. And San Francisco gives up over 18 fantasy points per game. You're not going to sit Aaron Rodgers. What about on the 49ers side of things? No Jimmy G, right? So we're back to Nick Mullins. In his 3 starts so far this year, he hasn't done bad. I mean, he's averaging right around 260 yards passing and almost a touchdown and interception per game. This week, no Debo, no Kittle, no Raheem Mostert. He didn't have those guys in Week 3, though, either against the Giants, and he put up 343 yards passing, 1 touchdown, and no interceptions. Now a matchup this week going up against Green Bay. They give up right around 17.5 fantasy points per game, but in my opinion, there's just too many questions surrounding this game that I want to trust Nick Mullins in Week 9 of fantasy football, especially after Week 8. A lot of people struggled Week 8. If you're looking for a bounce-back win, I believe there's other guys with higher ceilings this week. Now we'll move over to Sunday football. First game up, New York Giants, Washington football team. A matchup from Week 6 where we saw the Giants take that game 20-19. In that game, Daniel Jones didn't do a whole lot, at least not in the passing game anyway. 112 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. But lately, he's had to throw the ball a little bit more. This running game is pretty banged up, right? Devonta Freeman went down. They brought in Alfred Morris. Nobody really cares. Deion Lewis not being used. Are they really reliant on Wayne Gallman that much? I mean, it's really had to force Daniel Jones to throw the ball down the field more often. And because of that, he's had now 2 passing touchdowns in 2 straight games. Plus, we've seen the rushing upside from this kid before, right? Yeah, just because he's almost the world's fastest man doesn't mean he can really break away that 80-yard run just yet, but he's working on it. He's getting better, and the rushing upside definitely helps. The issue that I have with Daniel Jones is turnovers. It really lowers his ceiling. He has 13 turnovers so far on this season, and because of that limited ceiling, I can't start him here in Week 9. What about for Kyle Allen on the football team side of things? Well, kind of similar, right? Not a super high ceiling. Has 4 touchdowns to 2 turnovers so far this season. And he did have 42 pass attempts back in week 6 when these two teams played, and he threw for 2 touchdowns. Now, the Giants do allow right around 18 fantasy points per game, but the ceiling just isn't there to really push you over the top. I do believe there are better options here in week 9 that give you an opportunity to really take advantage of your matchup this week. This just isn't the time to really be starting Kyle Allen, in my opinion. Bears and Titans, and we can talk about the ever so steady Ryan Tannehill of the Tennessee Titans, but this is a very tough matchup for him going up against Chicago, who only allows right around 15.5 fantasy points per game. That's 4th fewest in the NFL. However, over the past 2 games, they've given up a combined 500 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, and no interceptions. Ryan Tannehill keeps that safe floor on a weekly basis. This week in the tough matchup, yeah, his ceiling may be somewhat limited. However, he's had at least 20 fantasy points in 4 straight games and at least 2 passing touchdowns 6 out of the 7 games he's played so far this year. Is he going to be an absolute must-start high top 5 quarterback? No, probably not, but he will be verge top 12, putting him in that quarterback 1 territory and a start here this week. What about Nick Foles on the Bears side of things? I really don't hate the matchup for him, right? Going up against Tennessee, they allow right around 20.5 fantasy points per game. And week 8, just last week, was the first time that he's had 2 passing touchdowns in a game since he took over the role in Chicago in week 3. I'm just not confident to trust Nick Foles here as of yet. The floor is right around 12 to 14 points, and I just don't believe he has that extra ceiling this week to put him over the top. If you're looking for a bye week fill-in, maybe in a super flex league, then I don't hate Nick Foles. If you're in a normal 10 to 12 man league, though, I'm not looking the way of Nick Foles here this week. On to the Lions and Vikings now, and I hinted at the beginning of the show that we had some recent news on a starting quarterback here, and it's all about Matthew Stafford. He didn't practice on Thursday, and then we found out later in the evening that he was placed on the COVID reserve list. That is no bueno for Matthew Stafford. However, as of yet, he's not entirely ruled out of the game on Sunday. It depends how many negative tests he can put together prior to the game before he's actually ruled out, or if it was a false positive, whatever it may be, it's a headache, right? So as of right now, we're going to talk as if Matthew Stafford is going to play. If he doesn't, I'm not starting whoever they put at quarterback, especially David Blough this week. So if we're talking about Stafford, he's coming off arguably one of his best games of the year, probably his best game of the year because it was against the Indianapolis Colts, a very solid defense where he put up 336 yards passing, 3 touchdowns and 1 interception in a game in which he lost Kenny Golladay, but then just turned around and utilized Marvin Jones and TJ Hawkinson a little more. Now in a matchup going up against the Vikings, who allow just about 22 fantasy points per game, which is 6th most in the NFL, we've seen the increase in his passing volume as of late, right? We talked about this a few weeks ago. He just wasn't throwing the ball a lot. Well, now, over the past 2 games, he's averaging 39 pass attempts a game. That's 8 more pass attempts per game than he was averaging earlier in the season. You're like, Jake, why do 8 pass attempts matter? Well, he averaged 8 yards per attempt, which means by adding those 8 attempts, it's boosting his production by about 64 yards a week, which just gives him more opportunities to rack up yardage and potential touchdowns. As of right now, I'm going to have Stafford as a start, but pay close attention. Obviously, if he gets ruled out, he's not a start. If you're banking on Matthew Stafford, make sure you have a reserve there on your bench ready to go in case word comes out late that he will not be available on Sunday. What about on the opposite side of things, right? Kirk Cousins. You remember that saying, burn me once, shame on you, burn me twice, shame on me? Yeah, I've been there with Kirk Cousins, and I just can't trust it anymore. There is no consistency to this guy's game. He had 14 pass attempts last week. 14 pass attempts last week against the Packers in a game which could have been a shootout for him. What's really taking away from it is the efficiency of Dalvin Cook, right? I mean, he looks so good on the ground. They're not having to throw as much because he's producing majority of the offense. He has the weapons, right? He's got Justin Jefferson. He's got Adam Thielen. He's got Dalvin Cook in the backfield. He's got tight ends, which he just never uses. They just don't throw enough to give him that weekly safe floor. I'm going to have to sit Kirk Cousins here in week 9. Panthers and Chiefs now, and Carolina has played pretty good against opposing quarterbacks here this season, allowing right around 16 fantasy points per game. But we're talking about Patrick Mahomes, and I don't care if Carolina's allowed to start 20 people on defense, I'm still going to start Patrick Mahomes. He's got 21 passing touchdowns this season to only 1 interception. Plus, last week, we saw a little bit of a red streak, right, from Andy Reid. He didn't care. He didn't let his foot off the gas. They ran it up a little bit on the Jets, and it wouldn't surprise me if they continue that here for a few weeks to really get this offense clicking heading in to the second half of the season. It's an obvious start. You're starting Patrick Mahomes. What about Teddy B? I mean, he's really been up and down for about his last 3 games or so. Over those last 3 games, he's quarterback 19 in fantasy football. He really produced a lot more numbers earlier in the season. He only has 3 combined touchdowns over his last 3 games played. Kansas City allows right around 16 fantasy points per game, which is 6th best in the NFL. I just don't have that confidence in Teddy B this week to go out there and put up a big number. In my opinion, a little bit too risky of a start. I'm going to sit Teddy Bridgewater here this week. Moving on to Houston and Jacksonville, and Deshaun Watson back off his bye week and directly back into your starting lineup for your fantasy football teams this week in a good matchup, right? Going up against Jacksonville, who allows over 23 fantasy points per game, 3rd most in the NFL. Plus, he was playing great before the bye week. 11 touchdowns to only 2 interceptions in his last 4 games played. Plus, he's thrown for over 300 yards in 4 straight games. You're not going to sit Deshaun Watson. He's going right back into the start column here this week. For Jacksonville, no Gardner Minshew. So take a look at Jake Luton. Do you even know who Jake Luton is? Maybe if you're an Oregon State football fan, but that's maybe about it. I went back and watched some tape on the kid, and he's not bad. He's a pocket-style quarterback, a big, strong-armed quarterback, right? 6'6", 224 pounds, and likes to throw the ball down the field. And reports are saying that they're going to let him do it. I mean, what do they really have to lose in Jacksonville, right? It's a decent matchup. They're allowing 21.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks are the Houston Texans. But really, I don't know if I can take a chance this big in week 9 of fantasy football. We're starting to reach that stretch where every win is basically a must-win to get you into the playoffs. Starting Jake Luton and all the unknown factors that he has in him, with it being his first ever NFL start, too much risk for me. Going to put him in the sit column. The Ravens and Colts, and we sat here on this show a few weeks ago and we were talking about Lamar Jackson, right? A lot of people frustrated with the lack of production from Lamar Jackson, just not those huge games like we saw at times last year. And one of the main reasons was the lack of a rushing upside, right? He really wasn't using his legs as much as he did last year. Well, over his last 2 games played, he's got 25 rush attempts for 173 yards and a touchdown, which is great. And over those 2 games, he's averaging over 23 fantasy points per game. But this is a tough matchup going up against Indianapolis, who only allows just under 15 fantasy points per game, one of the tops in the NFL. However, they were just torched last week by Matthew Stafford. We just talked about that a few minutes ago, so that kind of opens the door a little bit for Lamar Jackson. We need that rushing upside to continue to be there. Plus, Hollywood Browns come out and said, hey, I don't know if I like my role in this offense. Does Squeaky Wheel get the grease this week and force Lamar to throw the ball down the field? Maybe a big play could help boost the numbers. You're not going to sit Lamar Jackson here just yet. What about Phillip Rivers? He now has back-to-back games with throwing for at least 260 yards passing and 3 touchdowns. The Ravens allow almost 20 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but is Phillip Rivers kind of like fool's gold? I kind of feel like I'm ready for like a gotcha, right? He's starting to gain a little consistency. We're going to start him, and he's going to put up a dud. I can just feel it coming here this week because Indianapolis, not really known for throwing the ball that much, right? They're 7th in the NFL, 7th fewest in the NFL in pass attempts. They really have no true wide receiver one that they utilize, and they're really reliant on the passing game from their running backs to score their touchdowns. I'm going to have to pass on Phillip Rivers this week. It's not that the matchup is overly hard. I just don't know if I can continually bank on getting those receiving touchdowns out of the backfield on a weekly basis to make Phillip Rivers a viable start. Seahawks and Bills, and it should be a pretty good matchup here to watch, but it's time to let Russ start cooking once again. Buffalo allows just over 20 fantasy points per game, and Russ has had at least 3 passing touchdowns in 6 of his 7 games played so far this season. He's one of only 3 quarterbacks averaging over 30 fantasy points per game. You're going to fire up Russ. The pairing between him and Lockett and Metcalf is an absolutely beautiful sight to see in your fantasy rosters. But what about Josh Allen? Maybe this is the matchup he needs to get back on track, right? Because Seattle, they allow over 26 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, most in the NFL. And now, Allen's on a little bit of a bummer streak, right? You're kind of expected a little bit more here. As of late, he's actually gone 2 weeks without a passing touchdown, and over that span is quarterback 19 in fantasy football. That's not what you want to see from Josh Allen. This could be the game that he gets back up on track and really puts up some solid numbers here against this defense of the Seattle Seahawks. Going to start Josh Allen here this week. On to Denver and Atlanta now, and really a great matchup for both of these guys, right? Both defenses allow over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but do we trust Drew Lock just yet? I mean, he is coming off his best game of the season last week in Week 8, where he threw for 248 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception against the Los Angeles Chargers. And now he gets a matchup against the Falcons. They allow over 26 fantasy points per game, second most in the NFL. Really, the key here for me is Noah Fant. A healthy Noah Fant really makes Drew Lock a little bit safer because he utilizes him there in the passing game. Between him, Jerry Jeudy, and KJ Hamler, with a backfield of Gordon and Lindsey, I don't hate Drew Lock here this week. I'll start him as a bye week fill-in if needed. What about Matt Ryan? He just continues to be boom or bust, right? A crazy stat that I saw on Matt Ryan while researching this game. He has 1 or fewer touchdowns in 5 of his last 6 games played. What? I mean, he needs to pick it up if we really want to make sure he keeps that weekly safe start tag, because as of right now, it's just not there. Denver does allow 21 fantasy points per game. The biggest question mark here, does he have Calvin Ridley? Does he have Russell Gage? That's something we need to pay attention to as the week progresses, because as of right now, he may be a start, but he's a low-end start. I'm probably going to have him ranked right in that 12 to 14 range here later in the week. So this really depends on the options you have available. It's not a bad matchup. He just hasn't provided any consistency to give you that warm fuzzy here in your fantasy lineup. On to the Raiders and Chargers now, and it's just another one of those matchups that's great for both quarterbacks. Both teams allowing over 21 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and Justin Herbert just continues to impress people on a weekly basis. Now has 4 straight games with at least 3 passing touchdowns in each of them, and he's utilizing weapons all over the field. Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, now Tremaine Pope out of the backfield could kind of be the cherry on top here. Plus, the real kicker, his defense continues to give up points, forcing him to throw all game every single week. Over the last 4 games played, the Chargers defense has allowed at least 29 points to their opponent. Herbert's having to throw, and it's only putting up great fantasy numbers. He's going to remain a start. On the Vegas side of things, Derek Carr's going to be my Manscaped must-start of the week. Now, yes, last week was a very bad game for Derek Carr. It was a sloppy game overall between the Raiders and the Browns. Some bad weather played a part there, but this week I'm looking for the bounce back, and it's really based off of consistency, right? I mean, he's been super consistent. He's had at least 260 yards passing and at least 2 touchdowns the 5 games prior to last week's sloppy game. I'll fire up Derek Carr this week in a matchup against the Chargers, which we just talked about got torched by Drew Lock and the Broncos in the passing game last week. I like me some Derek Carr here in Week 9. On to Pittsburgh and Dallas, and Big Ben hasn't been setting the world on fire by any means. He's not out there just lighting up fantasy football scoreboards, but he hasn't been a bad start for a majority of the season. He's been pretty safe. He's had at least 2 passing touchdowns in 6 of his 7 games played, and we know on a weekly basis the ceiling is always going to be there just because of the weapons that he's going to have. Juju, Deontay Johnson when he's healthy, Chase Claypool when Deontay Johnson isn't healthy, James Conner in the backfield. He's got a lot of options on a weekly basis, and now he gets a matchup going up against Dallas, who we already know gives up more than 20 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. The only worry I have here is Big Ben getting a lead and not really being relied upon in the second half to throw much. However, it's not enough to worry me away to sit him. He's going to be in the start column here for me this week. What about on the Dallas side of things, right? No Andy Dalton, so we got Ben DiNucci again. Ben DiNucci going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who allow 17 fantasy points per game. And Ben DiNucci seems to have a little bit of a fumbling issue. Let me ask you a question. In week 9 of fantasy football, can you trust Ben DiNucci? Because I can't. Dolphins and Cardinals now, and is this the week? Is this the week? Is it time? Is it Tua time? Probably not. I mean, I expect him to improve this week by all means. Yes, absolutely over his performance in week 8. The more exposure and experience he gets in this offense, the better and better he's going to get. And in a matchup going up against Arizona, they allow just over 19 fantasy points per game. No Myles Gaskin in the backfield. How do they utilize Matt Breida? Do they get him involved in the passing game a little bit more? Do they ask Tua to throw the ball down the field? I think that there's an opportunity for it this week. However, in my fantasy football lineup, I want to see him produce that first before I take that gamble and that risk on it here, especially in week 9. Like I said, we're turning the corner where all these games are getting a lot more meaningful. I can't risk it until I can see him actually do it on the field. Going to sit Tua. What about for the Cardinals? Kyler Murray is going to be an automatic start, right? There's really no question. He's averaging over 30 fantasy points per game. Plus, he has that weekly rushing upside and has DeAndre Hopkins, who he can throw it to like 30 times a week if he wants to. Now, Miami, not a pushover. They only allow 16.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but with Kyler Murray's rushing upside and the weapons he has out there, you're never going to sit Kyler Murray. On to Tampa Bay, where we have the Saints and the Bucs up next, a rematch of Brady Breeze from week 1, the matchup that we all looked forward to, the matchup in which Breeze won, but Brady scored more fantasy points. This matchup, do they have Michael Thomas? Do they have Chris Godwin? There's some question marks surrounding this matchup that we really need to pay attention to going into the weekend, because really, both Brady, both Breeze, they're playing pretty well, right? Brady has gone 4 straight games now without an interception. Breeze has 10 touchdowns to only 2 interceptions over his last 5 games played. The biggest difference here, really, is on the defensive side of the football. The Bucs allow only 15.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's 3rd least in the NFL. The Saints, they allow over 22 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 5th most. I really prefer Brady over Breeze here once again from a fantasy perspective. However, if you're looking for a starter, I have no issue starting either one of these guys here this week. On to Monday Night Football, New England Patriots, New York Jets, whatever. I mean, I look at it like this. This is a great representation of this game. If you combine the passing touchdowns of Cam Newton and Sam Darnold over each of their last 3 games played, you will get a total of 0 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. There's just really nothing out there that makes me want to start Sam Darnold. I don't like the Jets' offense. I don't like the Jets' play calling him. I mean, he had a great run a couple weeks ago that gave me a solid fantasy day, but outside of that, nothing that I can trust that makes me want to start Sam Darnold. What about Cam Newton? Prefer not to start him either. At this point, he's so dependent on rushing touchdowns, it's almost scary, right? And the issue is, at the beginning of the season, he was getting them. Now he's only had 2 rushing touchdowns since September 20th. That's a problem. The Jets do allow over 21 fantasy points per game, which is 7th most in the NFL. But at this point, Cam Newton is just not a safe start, not somebody who I can trust at this point. Hopefully you have better options. He'll be one of these guys who'll be ranked probably within the top 20 just due to the matchup alone, but he won't be near the top of the top 20. All right, those are my starts and sits for the quarterback position here, Week 9 fantasy football. But just a reminder, if you've watched the NFL at all this year, you realize that things change a lot throughout the week. That's why we do our rankings episodes here later in the week, try to give some updated information. Plus, if you haven't checked out our Saturday night live stream yet, you may want to. We have a lot of fun. We spend 2.5 hours just communicating back and forth with the community, answering as many fantasy football questions as we possibly can in that allotted amount of time. But we greatly appreciate the support. We look forward to hearing from you guys later in the week. Have a great one. We'll talk to you later.